This is Tech Talk Detroit with Brian Spurgeon and Chuck Lobert. Tech Talk Detroit brings you the latest in tech news and Detroit happenings every week.
Welcome back to Tech Talk Detroit. This is a special episode for us because we got our very first question from the audience. So we wanted to talk about that question, and then that'll lead into some further topics. So the question that came in is they had heard in a previous episode where we talked about a lot of problems that businesses have is not fully utilizing the investments that they make in different tools and software. And specifically, we had mentioned Office 365 and how a lot of companies just use the email functions in it and don't really take advantage of the rest of the suite of tools and software, the services that are built into it. So they're wondering what else should they be using. So this is a question that really we can spend several weeks talking about, and we will in future episodes go a little bit more in depth into the different tools that Office 365 has in it. But for this particular episode, we wanted to talk about SharePoint. So we invited our resident SharePoint expert, Abbey Colville, to sit in with us and talk about that tool inside of Office 365 and specifically how we can use it for team collaboration. But for starters, Brian, why don't we talk a little bit about what licenses within Office 365, within Microsoft 365, include SharePoint so that people know whether or not they even have it as an option for them to consider using?
Yeah, so I think when you're looking at the plans that you have, the honest answer is the majority of the plans do include SharePoint licensing. And really, you're really looking at the email only. The Exchange Online plans are really going to be the only exclusions to that. So starting with Business Essentials and on up, they're all going to have SharePoint. They're all going to give you OneDrive access as well. And once you get to the business premium plans, that's also going to include the software, and then everything else from there just gives you a lot extra features. So I think the key is most people make the move to Office 365 to get their email in the cloud. And much like any other business, any other applications that you take on, a lot of times that's just kind of where it stops at. And you're only taking advantage of just a small percentage of what the features are to give you. So I think SharePoint is one of those untapped resources that really you're paying for and you're not using. So I think, this is a great topic. It's a good opportunity to kind of dive in and for everybody to understand what SharePoint does and maybe how your business should be using it.
And I think SharePoint's a kind of a good central spot that gets you into some of the other tools too, like Teams, like OneDrive for Business, and so on. So with that being said, why don't we invite Abbey in here? All right, well, welcome, Abbey.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're happy to have you on. I thought maybe we could kind of start the discussion with why should companies even really be looking at SharePoint? Why would they want to utilize that particular part of the Office 365 investment?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you guys mentioned, it's already available in so many of the plans, and it's really great to use as a company intranet. It makes file shares super easy. It can even reduce some of the third-party platforms you might be using, like it can replace an employee portal for HR. It's also really great for automating business processes. So take away those emails and those manual processes that so many people are stuck doing in the office. And lastly, it's even great for inventory tracking. If you keep stock on hand, it can really automate and reduce some of the inefficiencies that businesses see.
Oh, cool. Well, why don't we talk about the file sharing first? I know a lot of what I hear out there is kind of why would I use SharePoint for file sharing? Because we've already got OneDrive. And, it's kind of a common misconception. So why don't we talk about that a little bit and what that misconception is and why SharePoint versus OneDrive, which fits the right, bill.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I see a lot of companies that are, what I would say is using the data wrong. So the biggest difference between when to use OneDrive versus SharePoint is going to be ultimately a user's personal data versus company shared data. So each user gets OneDrive data up to 1 terabyte. And what that's used for is that user's individual files. So the most common use case that we like to implement and take advantage of is using that as a personal folder redirection, right? So you can take your desktop, you can take your documents folders, favorites, any folder that any user creates that they save their files to locally, and you can have that backing up to OneDrive on the back end. So for one reason, it's going to eliminate the need to maintain and manage workstation backups. You're already paying for the storage again, so you might as well take advantage of it. And the other key is it makes it really easy the next time you need to buy a new computer, or if you want to reload Windows 10 again. Just by logging in back into your OneDrive account, you're able to just bring that data back on locally. So yeah, that's going to be the biggest difference. Each user is going to get a terabyte of OneDrive storage. Now, going to SharePoint, think about that as from your traditional server standpoint. So, everybody knows you have a map drive. Everybody's connected to the P drive, the public drive. Think about SharePoint as a replacement potentially to that shared drive. So that's where the company data is. So that's going to be the data that multiple people are connecting to, working off of, collaborating, and you want all of that data stored in the cloud in that SharePoint site. The biggest thing too is going to be some of the features that you're going to get with the SharePoint versus keeping it in OneDrive. The biggest thing I think is going to be the versioning. So with having a file stored in SharePoint, not only can multiple people work on it at the same time, but you can keep multiple versions of that file. So if at any point in time you need to roll back to a previous update, or if somebody accidentally deleted something out, you can turn on a lot of that functionality to make sure that you're having a lot more document control. And then, once we get into another episode, more into the security stuff and compliance features, you're going to be able to control a lot of sensitive documents much better in SharePoint. OneDrive, again, because it's personal, you can't really control who those users are sharing that stuff out to. So I think that's a big difference between it, is going to be OneDrive for personal and SharePoint for the business data.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily that you can just say, I've got a file share today, I'm going to move to SharePoint. There are certain limitations, certain scenarios where SharePoint might not be the right fit, right? There's a certain number of items in the shares and totally. So on that you might not need to consider before you make that move. But in a lot of scenarios, it's going to make sense for the organization.
Yeah, I think a good way to look at it, what we see is a lot of SMBs that are really just hanging on to a local file server, and that's really the only function that local server is providing. A SharePoint move typically makes sense. So if you're talking about your office documents and need a good place to store it, you're going to get a terabyte of SharePoint storage plus 10 gigabytes for every user that you have licensed in Office 365. So that's where I see the most common use case is replacing just an old file share that you have locally. But if you're a type of company that's doing a ton of design, you're doing a ton of CAD work, where you're dealing with large files that are providing, high data throughput, you're not going to get that from SharePoint, and it's not going to have the capability. So I think, it is important to assess, will SharePoint work for our business needs? But generally speaking, if you're just talking about Office documents, I think it's a great option for an SMB.
Absolutely. It's not necessarily to say that if you have those other types of AutoCAD documents and such that cloud isn't an option for you. It just might be a different way of doing cloud. It might not be SharePoint. It might be something else. But there's always several different ways to kind of look at doing anything. So, Abby, I know a lot of what you spend your time on is really looking at kind of the design around SharePoint and building out those intranets and the employee portals and stuff like that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that capability and I think a lot of people don't really understand what you can do with it.
SharePoint is really endless at this point, especially with the integrations available with the other Microsoft 365 and O365 products. So, for instance, there's a tool that can be integrated called Planner, and that helps run meetings, assign tasks, deliver them to your cell phone. And that's just one of the small examples. In terms of an employee portal, you can set permissions to allow your individual users to only access their specific HR-sensitive documents, and request PTO can go through an approval chain and instantly update their PTO. So it really is all over the board. It's more, what can your imagination produce?
So what you're talking about is a lot of workflows, a lot of different templates that you can build into SharePoint to kind of help make a lot of that automated, right?
Absolutely. Automation and collaboration are really the two main areas of SharePoint.
And I know one of the questions that we get a lot from specifically our legal and our financial clients is, what about the security? A lot of people are concerned about, well, is that secure enough for me to have my client data up there? So let's talk a little bit about it, and we'll get a bit more into it in a future episode when we really get in depth into Office 365 security as a whole. But is that a concern with SharePoint? Why should people not be concerned about it? I guess is probably the better way to ask it.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, from a security standpoint, you should always be concerned no matter what you're doing, right? And I mean that in the sense of security should always be in the forefront of your mind. But I think you shouldn't be scared of SharePoint as a security concern. And ultimately, that goes to making sure that you're doing the proper assessment, making sure that your data that is sensitive is treated as such when you move it to there. So there's a lot of setup that needs to go into SharePoint. I'm not suggesting that it's something where if you decide you want to do SharePoint, that this weekend you're shutting down the server and copying data into a folder and everything's good to go, right? There's a lot of planning, I would say, that goes into that. But if it is set up properly with proper permission levels, you should be able to control who has access to what, who can only read documents, who can even see folders, and you can get that level of control over there. And again, going back into the security and compliance features of Office 365, there's a lot of advanced security that you can implement, such as watermarking documents, right? You might have an employee, you might have a customer-facing form that's on there that has, important information pertaining to your business, maybe some legal disclaimers and such. You can watermark those documents that say confidential, so that a general user can't just go in there and share out a file and change some verbiage and send things out. So you can do things like that. You can restrict basically any file from any location you want. You can set time controls on there where employees can only access it inside of your building. So there's an endless amount of ways that you can secure it. The key is just finding what's the most applicable to your business. So, but yeah, I think in terms of security, it just depends on the type of data you have, and you just got to do the right planning to make sure that ahead of time before you make the move, you have all those angles covered.
And I think, it's always important to remember, too, with anything Office 365, you want to be talking about multi-factor authentication. That's another thing that you talk about with SharePoint security. So there's lots of stuff that you can do, kind of like you mentioned, to make sure that that data is secure. The nice part about it being out in the cloud and in Office 365 is it's pretty much going to always be available. It's a guaranteed 99.99% uptime. So it's always available. It's always up. You're not reliant on the internet at your office or anything else in order to be able to access all of those documents. But why don't we talk a little bit about, we talked about how SharePoint is kind of that central point that kind of branches into the other tools. One of those main tools that SharePoint really branches into is Teams. So why don't we talk a little bit about Teams? Again, that's another topic. We'll kind of get more in depth into the future, but we can talk today about how it ties into SharePoint, what that integration looks like.
Yeah, I think Teams has become probably one of my favorite tools over the last year. We've been using it for a couple of years. But in the last year, I think we really made a business decision to commit to it and try to use it to its fullest. So really what Teams is a replacement to Skype for Business. So in the past, Skype for Business was essentially just a chat client that you would use internally. And now Teams take that and overlay the whole Office 365 platform into it. So you still have the elements of chat, but you also can bring in SharePoint. You can create different channels inside of there that correlate and tie back to SharePoint team sites you have. You can pull down any of the files you have in a SharePoint library and access them from that client. And I think ultimately that's where we're seeing a lot of interest and where a lot of people start to get their foot in the door with SharePoint is they want to have this local Teams program that they can use to just kind of have essentially managed access to all their data. So
I think of it even as like almost like an integration of like a tool like Slack, and then you've got your file shares because you can integrate your files into Teams through SharePoint. You even can replace your phone systems. You've got phone calling that can be brought into it, and then like you mentioned, the Skype for Business, you can bring in that instant messaging piece. So it's kind of the merger of a bunch of different products into one platform that you can use. So really, depending on what your workday looks like, you could potentially work almost 100% just out of the Teams platform. And Abby, maybe you can talk a little bit about that integration specifically with SharePoint and what data you can bring into Teams.
It's truly a single pane of glass when you're using Teams. You don't have to navigate from your web portal to SharePoint. It is built into Teams. So if there's a landing page that your company uses, say a company intranet page, that can be a channel right within your Teams site. You click the button, you're right there. And that goes for your employee portal. The planner that I mentioned earlier, it's all integrated. So have your company work from one spot really increases productivity.
I know I really like it from the standpoint of, even our weekly leadership meetings, we use it to be able to, whether people are in different areas or we're in the office, we can use Teams to kind of run that meeting and then bring in stuff like SharePoint and Planner and such to be able to time the meetings and follow the agenda and make tasks for everybody and everything. So it really kind of helps to make those meetings a lot more efficient and give us a platform to really, we have one spot where everything resides.
Yeah, and with reoccurring meetings such as our leadership meeting, there's the chat feature still built into the meeting, so all your historical notes and chats are saved, as well as files. If anyone shares out files, you don't have to go searching for them. They're right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, too, another big advantage of both Teams and SharePoint is, these are open platforms that can be developed out and customized. And with that becomes a ton of different APIs from third-party vendors that are trying to take their products and tie them in. So, there's a lot of different business productivity applications that are in like the SharePoint store that you can go and purchase. Some of them, well, there's a ton free, there's some for purchase, but you can build out and add features that bolt onto your SharePoint client, and then those will also extend into Teams. So I think it's one of those things where you get it set up, you start to use it, you use it for chat, you start to build a couple different teams, you pull in these files from SharePoint now, and then you start to realize how much more and more you can do. I think our main line of business application that we use to track all of the work that we're doing, there's companies now that are creating an API where our ticketing system can be inputted right into Microsoft Teams now. And if you factor in the fact that you can also move your phone system to Microsoft Teams, you essentially could run your whole business from one application. And to me, that's an intriguing thing to do from a management standpoint, from a cost standpoint, and then just from a training standpoint. When you're talking about being able to focus on one product line and have everybody in sync, and I think there's a huge advantage to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know it sounds like we may have gotten away from SharePoint, but the truth is they're one and the same. So if you have a Microsoft team, you also have a SharePoint associated with that team, and it just ties together. So say you're not able to use your Teams app for some reason, even though it's available online, you can still access your SharePoint site.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing to look at is, yes, you're talking about technically different pieces of the Office 365 suite, but everything is so integrated that that's what makes it so collaborative. You can really be on any platform. You can be accessing it online or through software on your computer, and you can still access all of the same data, really whichever way works best for you, whether it's logging in online and going into SharePoint or using Teams on a phone or on a tablet or on a computer, whatever it is, it's really set up in order to be able to use it whatever way works best.
Yeah, and I think that's the key too is, there's a Teams mobile app, but there's also a SharePoint mobile app that allows you to easily access your team sites and files too. And another thing that we didn't even mention was with OneDrive, OneDrive, again, should be used for the terabyte of storage should be used for personal. However, you can also connect to your SharePoint data stores, your folders online to your local Windows 10 computer. And you have the option then to access all of the files that you normally would by hitting the website on your local computer, but you can also sync those locally to your computer if you know you're going to go traveling, right? And you want to have access to files on the plane. You don't want to go pay $25 for 1990 internet. So you can go and sync those locally and work on them on your plane. And then the next time you get onto an internet connection, whatever changes you made to those files will automatically sync back up to the cloud to SharePoint Online. So I think that's a key way to explain it is these are all different ways to access the same data.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily something you want to do where you sync your entire, server shares that got moved out to SharePoint to your computer, because now you're taking up a lot of space on your computer. You're trying to sync a ton of stuff. But in the use case of, I'm going to be on the plane and I want to be able to work on this document, you can sync just certain pieces of that data, certain files, certain folders, whatever it is, work on it. And then, like you said, when you get back online, you can send it up. And it's very easy to switch those shares or those files between being out in the cloud or being synced to your computer.
Totally. Yeah, and it's without seeing it, it's hard to explain, but it's their selective sync feature if you wanted to look at it a little bit. But when you connect to the SharePoint, everything's cloud only, and you just have the option as you open files to individually take them local. And if you ever need to free up space, there's the features built in to unsync those locally. And again, it's just a great way to access the same data, and it's all based on preference. There's no wrong way to get to it. So.
Yeah, so would you both agree that for most organizations, if not all, SharePoint has a fit in the organization? It's just kind of a matter of working with somebody that really understands it to determine what the right fit is for the organization?
Absolutely. It's going to be customized for your organization. A manufacturer is going to use it much differently than an attorney would, but it absolutely has a fit in any scenario.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think everybody should be using for it. You're paying for it. There is a use case for any business to have that. And, I think one of the key things, though, is before you make that decision, though, it's one of those tools where it has to be something that is continually in the front of mind. So it's not one of those tools where you're going to configure out, put data in there, and then just let it sit. There should be a ongoing interest to keep maximizing the use out of SharePoint. One of the big obstacles I see is getting your team members to buy in, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of times people in general are just opposed to any kind of major change. So when you're talking about moving to something as big as this, SharePoint, I think it's important too to really kind of build up that hype amongst your employees to get people excited for that move and not to take on too much at one time. I think, again, it's one of those tools where you want to pick kind of one workflow to take into the cloud, get that in a good spot, and then take on the next workflow. So it's one of those ongoing developments.
I completely agree with Brian. User adoption is so important. You should have an adoption plan with your team. Sometimes they last as long as 3 to 6 months, but if your users aren't going to adopt the program, it's going to be completely unsuccessful no matter how well developed your SharePoint platform is.
And I think to go along with that, it really has got to start from the top down, right? If the leadership isn't using it, if the leadership isn't enforcing it, then the rest of the employees probably aren't going to see the value in using it either. So I think if you start at the top down and you have that planned in user adoption period where you're providing training and you're showing the features of it and showing the benefits of it, I think that's when it really you get a lot more buy-in.
Absolutely. It's never great, especially in a larger organization, just to roll it out to everyone at one time. It's really hard to adopt that way.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you being on with us today, Abby.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, in future episodes, we'll talk a lot more about Office 365 and the different tools that are built into it. But we really wanted to take this time, especially based on our question, to kind of focus in on SharePoint and why it's such a great tool for collaboration. So we appreciate you being on with us, and we look forward to next week.